You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name's Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. In this episode, I was joined by Rajmund Andrzejczak, who retired last year as Poland's chief of the general staff. The good general was kind enough to join me in Washington during his recent visit. So what brings you to Washington?
Now we have a conference. The Polish International Relations Institute has a conference in Washington related to Polish-American relations. And of course, it's a very dynamic security environment. So not only Polish-US relations are objectives to explain, but widely geostrategical situation. And it's always nice to be in Washington.
And what have you been doing since you left? You were chief of the general staff,
yeah,
and you resigned in October last year.
Yeah.
What have you been doing since then?
Well, explaining that I'm not successfully retired. So on the very first day, I was engaged. I was inspired by Sławek, my partner, who's the director of Polish International Relations Institute, to have a special mission. And we have a program in the YouTube called Ground Zero. And this is our effort to explain the huge strategical change that we observe and put the Poland in the global context. So that's my mission. So sometimes my family, they say I'm more busy than I used to be in the army.
Let's rewind a little bit. Why did you become a soldier?
Well, my dream was, as a boy, was to be a pilot, really. So my love to the aviation is still in my heart. But unfortunately, I've been in a couple of tests, but my backbone is not good enough to be a F-16 or F-35 pilot, but good enough to be a tanker. So I joined Army and I spent most of my life in the tanks. However, in the end, I fell in love in a different platform, which is APC, Wild, Rosomak, Wolverine. But to be honest, the most important always are soldiers. There's amazing profession.
And how old were you when you joined?
I was 24. Sometimes I make a joke that in 1991, two very important things happened concerning armor, history of armor. H.R. McMaster was in charge of 73 Easting Battle, and I was promoted to second lieutenant. So sometimes we're joking that we started pretty interesting. Even more important is 1991 was a time when the Polish transformation, political, social, economical transformation started. Soviet army left Poland. Cold War ended. So everything up to today was exactly my 36 years of service, including my time when I was a cadet in Academy, 87 and 91. And then since 91 was, end of Warsaw Pact. Then there was, Balkan War. Then we had battles around, including the situation in Georgia, Crimea, of course, Iraq and Afghanistan. So this is a fascinating life trip to observe from a soldier's perspective what happened.
Tell me about your first experience of command.
An amazing platoon leader. You have 3 tanks. That time the structure was the 3 tanks. I was absolutely focused on my mission. The very first important experience was, especially in armor, how NCO Corps is important. So being second lieutenant is one thing, being officer, commander, leader. But to be a team builder and to use experiences of your NCOs was absolutely amazing. So people, always people.
And what kind of tanks were you driving around?
I started with the T-72s, spent a pretty long time, and then when Poland decided, I was the chief of defense, when Poland decided to send in those tanks to Ukraine during crisis time, there was actually tanks from my battalion I commanded many years ago. And I said, well, this is the spectacular situation. We're changing and we're buying, brand new equipment, except the low parts, we just brand new M1A2 SEP3 version US tanks, Korean K2, so different generations. That was a little bit emotional for me.
Yeah, as a tanker, to oversee all that must have been very special.
Absolutely.
Who was your favorite boss that you had before you became a general officer?
When I was posted to the highest position, chief of defense, I made 4 calls. And I called to 2 generals. One was John Bierzewski, the corps commander, who was amazing, very highly educated, open mind, very patient commander. Then I called to my brigade commander, Jan Zatoński, who gave me a chance to be really battalion commander and gave me a chance to test and to command whatever I wanted. Then I called to my first sergeant, company sergeant. He's unfortunately passed away, and I'm missing him very much. And then I called to my command sergeant major from the time when I was a brigade division commander, warrant officer Voltman. And this is, I think, pretty easy to understand who my heroes are.
And do you still talk to them all today?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have still contact. Sometimes I'm asking for some opinions, and I think this is the critical balancing between be a general, very high-ranking officer and not lost contact with reality on the ground. So it's not easy. It's not only about technology; it's more about the culture, trust, and about you self-awareness, discipline. So leadership is absolutely the most important thing.
Every country does this a bit differently, but what is the role of Chief of Defense in Poland?
Good question for $1 million. I would say for people, it's a kind of a translator. So you are not in the army actually, because you belong into the Office of Minister of Defense, and you're not politicians because you cannot. So you listen to carefully what the army needs, and then you have to translate it into sufficient language to the politicians. And then at the same time, you have to listen to, and in a democratic structure, what the political objective is, and then translate political requirements and political agenda into the military language, which you're just in the middle, which is not an easy mission. So you are not commander in definition when you are battalion or brigade or division. But at the same time, you are never politician. So you are guarding standards. You're always telling through to the politicians, recommending, certain solutions or recommending decisions to be taken. But at the same time, civil control is critical. So the army is, belonging to the nation and under the political control.
Bring us into your perspective in 2018 when you took that position. It was 2018, correct?
Yeah.
What were the major issues that you were dealing with at the time?
That was a tough time. When I was posted, I started to visualize my concept and strategic design, where the army should go. And then COVID happened, which was not military mission. So because in my strategic concept, one of the most important parameters was speed and ability to adapt to the new unpredictable environment. So I said, well, let's take it as a test. And Army really approached to the COVID as a logistically, medical, many other aspects in a very high level. So all of the social assessment, also political assessment during the COVID time was very positive. Once we completed mission, Polish and Belarusian border was under fire, I would say. It was a typical proxy operation. Russia decides to weaponize illegal migration and use against Polish borders.
They were mostly from the Middle East?
People are from the Middle East, but design, and this is absolutely no questions about it. There's the Russian and Belarusian, special forces on Intel, Spetsnaz, and also KGB involved and pushing people across the border. So there was a huge challenge for us as well, because typically, and according to the regulations, that kind of mission belongs to the border police. And then the scale was so big that the politicians decided to engage also armed forces to support. And this is not sitting in the close to the fence, being armor, artillery, or air defense, NCO or officer, is not what you want and not what you are prepared for. But it was also a very challenging and successful mission, very dangerous. And nowadays, you see what's going on.
What do you feel like the Russian and Belarusian political objective was? Was it simply retaliation to sow chaos, or was there some sort of larger goal they were trying to accomplish?
If you look in more or less in the so-called Gerasimov doctrine, which is implementation of the Russian instrumentarium, so it's a political corruption, is the sabotage, it's managing the info zone, fake news, and then in the back you have hard power, is exactly what the Gerasimov is talking about, and we see everywhere. So there's a weaponizing illegal migration, engaging people in the Middle East, sometimes in Africa, help them to go to the closer. 90% of people we're engaging right now in Belarus, in Polish-Belarusian border, they have a Russian visa. So who doesn't understand? And then it was testing our resilience and our social cohesion in a relatively cheap way, because Russia is, we have huge challenges with the attribution. And the most important in NATO eastern flank, except the hard power, military instruments of power, is of course cohesion, is mutual trust, among the countries, leadership, and so on. So the Russians, they realize that democracy, standards, those values we share are are important, but also there are opportunity for them to engage. And this is absolutely critical right now to increase social, informational resilience, not to be, just too weak in certain points.
You were about to talk about Poland's role in the Afghanistan evacuation.
Yeah, I spent also 2 rotations, 1 by 1. The first time that was 2008, 2009. I spent a time with the 101st Division. My boss was Jeff Schlosser, amazing, Eagle 6, call sign. That was a time when the Polish government decided to go from battalion up to brigade level. So we were given separate province. Ghazni was my province. And I spent 1 rotation. Then there was 82nd General Scaparrotti came as CJTF commander. So I spent a lot of time. And then when I moved back to Poland and I realized we're leaving, part of my heart was really crying because I spent so many times, in so many things we invested. I lost 11 soldiers, which is interesting because in Poland, if you look in my rotations, it's only 7, but I lost 4 Americans, which were under my control. So I'm always saying totally 11 soldiers. And then in one time you see, airplanes and chaos in the airfield. And then the operation was very much dynamic. So we sent aviation, we sent special forces as well, and we evacuated a few times more people than we expected. So it was a tremendous, absolutely amazing operation of Polish SF and Air Force. Yeah, we were lucky. There was a time when I was waiting for final report, smoking one of the biggest cigars in my life. And finally, my subordinates, they called me, right? Everybody airborne, everybody's flying back to Poland. Then we realized we got some shots in our airplanes. A few hours later on, I realized we lost Marines in a gate. There was a huge tragedy from emotional, human, perspective, and it was always killing my heart. And then one day, when I thought this everything in my service, I'm waiting for report in the middle of the night again, 22nd of February, and my operation commander calling me, and he said, "Sir, there they go." So war started, 8 million Ukrainians, that's the total number crossing Polish border. We started support, spectacular support. There was a social approach, absolutely phenomenal behaving of Polish society, opening the houses for Ukrainians. Then we started military support, financial, political support as well. And the very first days, the Polish Prime Minister moved to Kiev as the first. So still going on.
I'd love to dig into your perspective and what you saw, especially in the lead up to that war. Starting in November, October the year before, what were you seeing? When was it clear to you that Russia was actually planning to go in?
This is very interesting. I've been here in December in Washington. I was talking to General Milley, a good friend of mine. We spent some time in Afghanistan. We had a very long discussion. I think one of the longest visits in the Pentagon. So we knew exactly, from an operational point of view, it was clear the Russians going to the war. But still, I had some concerns about political, goal, political trigger. So from military perspective, it was pretty clear that the Russians are going. We sent some messages. We, NATO, sent some messages as a warnings, as a deterrence. So we activated JRP's plans, regional plans. I was talking to General Walters that time, SOCUR. Unfortunately, it was not enough for Russians to stop, and war started.
You have led from the military side up until you left last October, the largest military buildup in modern Polish history, at least since the end of the Cold War, I should say. Talk to me about where that's heading, the trajectory, the broad outlines of that.
Yeah, that's what you said. There's an absolutely historical, change in the Polish army. It's not so huge surprise for Poles because of our historical context. We know exactly what Russia is about and how they behave. So there was a political guidance and political decision to increase defense spending. There was a huge social support and understanding. And of course, which is very important, sometimes missing, and Poland is big enough that our economy lasts 35 years. That's what we're missing. This is exactly the time when I mentioned, since I was promoted to second lieutenant and HR master was moving to the Tawakalna division in Iraq. It was a huge progress. So we get the money. And so if you put on the table the 3 things, political will, political understanding, then social acceptance and economical capability. So this change was possible. We increased up to 4% GDP. And then we started, because it was absolutely very difficult to predict back in the history, the situation when we sent hundreds of equipments to Ukraine, because that was a political objective, to let them win, keep them fighting. So tanks, APCs, we sent helicopters, airplanes, howitzers, 1,000 millions, pieces of ammunition. Poland immediately decided to build, which was strategical political risk, build a logistic hub in Rzeszów, which is difficult to pronounce, so the Americans always get it, the J-Town, so you call it J-Town. And then that still is one of the most important parts of a logistic chain. That was spectacular, and now we are in a very dynamic situation. So part of the equipment is leaving Polish army because of war in Ukraine, when we try to do our best. New equipment is coming, which is a huge challenge from a logistical point of view, training, sustainment, doctrine, and so on. But we don't live in the ideal world. So we're trying to synchronize all of those processes, and I still believe our soldiers, men and women, are absolutely fascinating job, and I'm really proud of every single soldier, Polish army.
And the buildup itself, much more investments in armor, what else?
Well, Poland is ground heavy, is land oriented historically. That's one of the biggest difference between US and Poland, not only about scale, but sometimes I'm joking to say you are sailors because your interests are always somewhere else. So projection of force is your DNA. And that's the reason the Navy is critical for US to control, navigation, control, logistics, trade, and so on. For Poland, we are more philosophically like farmers. So we are focused on ground, and that's the reason that Poland is heavily investing in a ground component, which is tanks, which is artillery, long-range fires, and of course air defense, which is critical right now. And then the next is Air Force, and then next is Navy, cyberspace, and so on. So that's our approach. Definitely ground heavy.
And of course, Poland has been buying a lot of equipment from the United States, but also from South Korea, which is, I think, very interesting.
Yeah, if you look in the Polish army right now, so M1A2s are coming in a brand new version, and I realized that you revitalized the production of the tanks in the US, which is good news for...
Well, I didn't do it, but I'll happily take credit for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the M1s, then we go to HIMARSs, which are critical long-range fires. So we really want to have long hands, 70, 300, or even more. Then we're going to Patriot systems, but not only a defense as effectors, but also command and control system, IBCS, which is absolutely critical. The most important that I'm waiting for is the F-35s coming. We just started training in the US. And the last couple of weeks, my president and my prime minister, they visited Mr. President Biden, and we decided to buy 800 missiles. So if we really complete the contract, it will be the biggest owner of that kind of a capability. 96 Apaches, which will be the biggest flying tanks in the region, and many others, sophisticated equipment and logistics, communication and stuff. So Poland is heavily, engaged, and we're investing very much in the US production. Because the access to the equipment, Korean contracts, which are K2 tanks, K9 artillery, and Chumno, which more or less is MLRS systems, or because they are available, production line was on, and of course a little bit of mitigation and diversification or logistics issues.
And they deliver on time.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of absolutely spectacular modernization and the fastest in history. We have to very much focus on a proper approach. It's only about the tanks, but the logistics, training, infrastructure, looking very much for new doctrine as a multi-domain concept. So huge challenge, and I'm really cross fingers for my successor, who's working very hard in Warsaw.
I think it's really important what Poland's doing. I think Poland's really a model ally in terms of investing in its own defense, investing in Europe's defense. Buying all this equipment and making these investments is, of course, an important step. How is Poland approaching the manning and training part of this? Because you have all this new equipment flowing in. You're now going to need to train soldiers and service members on it, probably recruit more people, expand the size of the armed forces. What are some of the challenges associated with that?
Yeah, a lot of challenges. We had a lot of analyses and simulations concerning demography and recruitment. So up to 28, more or less, is pretty optimistic. Then we will have several challenges. The demography will be a huge challenge for Poland, not only from a military perspective, but also economy. So my approach and my recommendations, my plans were and are still continuing. It will be a couple of directions. First is, of course, investing in the people, looking for, because the Polish army aspiration is 300,000 totally. So in the 300,000 means full-time service operational forces. Now we have a territorial defense, which is very important. Then we're looking back and we see a new project, which is voluntary conscription. I just put on the table discussion about the conscriptions anyway, in a different way, not like Cold War time.
Involuntary conscription?
Yeah, but there'll be more about chance for young generation to join the army, not necessarily as a forcing them to go immediately, because the social change and social transition is so high. So from my perspective, it would not be effective in the old-fashioned way. And then we go to reserve, active and passive reserve. So depending on, calculations, because you still, if you're asking soldier, I would say 300,000 active duty, but as a citizen, I know exactly to keep the development of Polish economy, I have to be responsible that some of the people should be in the economy and not necessarily in the army. So that kind of synchronization isn't one issue. Second approach, when I'm promoting very much, is automatization and robotization. So artificial intelligence and autonomous platforms is the way. And this is one of the lessons learned we don't see from Ukraine, because the Russian army or Ukrainian army, they don't use autonomous platforms except UAVs, but no ground autonomous platforms and robotic systems. So sometimes, if you see there will be bigger army, highly motivated, and well paid and well trained, but in the same time, in the composition, I think we should concern more and more robotics. And then we see, I think it's not easy from demographical point of view, but as far as I see here, interest, young people, officer schools, NCOs, and private, it's relatively high.
Is there political will? I don't follow Polish politics closely, admittedly, but is there political will across, the various parties and the ruling coalition to increase the size of the military?
Yeah, increase the size, there's no question about it. But this is the political, will and political decision. But implementation is much more complicated. But I think, conscription is not only about the combat power, but also social effect. If you're going up and down, you still have a natural fluctuation, and you're going through the army. So the citizen of Poland feels much more responsible because you got experiences, you have insight what's going on inside the army. You got friends. So, and of course, the more important, the third direction. First, as I said, 300,000, composition. Second, automatization. And the last one is, what I'm emphasizing very much, is resilience, which means not necessarily soldiers, but media, for example, like you're presenting for. I don't want to be honest, I don't want you to go and to take the machine gun. If you are a good, journalist, let's do your job in the wartime. If you're good in the banking system or cyber, for example, so do your job. But the most important is synchronization, especially in the very foggy proxy scenarios, which are peacetime, crisis time, wartime, overlapping each other. So the social acceptance, social readiness, trust to the politicians, to the leadership, trust to the soldiers, people, different positions, different jobs, that this builds resilience. That's what I observed being a couple of times in the Kiev. So there's a place for everybody to be a soldier or just be the useful citizen.
I've been somewhat disappointed in my own country's defense department's organized efforts to formally learn lessons from what's happening in Ukraine. And I think one of the limitations is we're just not there. We don't have battlefield observers. I'm not talking about advisors, but observers, which I've been arguing for. And my friend Zach Griffiths has also been arguing for, who's an army officer. How has Poland organized a formal lessons learned effort about what's happening in Ukraine? Because it's very clear, unlike the United States, which could be fighting one of several countries in its next war, Russia being one of them. Poland, if a war comes, it's pretty clear who it's going to be with. So how is Poland learning lessons based on what's happening?
I would say yes and not. First is, of course, we got our direct borders with Russia, which is Kaliningrad. 40 kilometers from the border is a city when the Russian Chernyahovsk, which is the Russian 152 artillery brigade, which is Iskander equipped. So we know it very well, 40 kilometers. Then we have Belarus, where Russia announced the location of nuclear weapons in Belarus. So for us, it's clear where the enemy is and where the threat is coming from. But in the same time, I would say we have the two biggest, it'll be brutal explanation, but let's explain that way. We have the two biggest laboratories of war. One is Gaza, the second one is Ukraine, or from a Polish perspective, Ukraine and Gaza. So we see everything, not only equipment, no UAVs, tanks, BMPs, HIMARSs, flying, Patriots and so on. But also we see context of using military instruments of power by Russia or Hamas, war in the info zone. We see role of sanctions, role of economy, financial issues, social, and so on. So we observe what's going on in Ukraine. Some of the lessons learned are in the private think tanks, private institution, no classified, but many of the analyses we have are very much classified. I spent some time also talking to Chief of Defense of Ukraine. I've been talking to General Zaluzhny and General Syrski as well. So we're preparing for the next scenario, but I would say I'm not sure that publicly in the social perception what we see the next war will be the same like we see in Ukraine. So Russia is always fighting in a different way. There was a different way in Georgia, different way in Crimea, different way in Syria, different way they're fighting right now. In the beginning of the war, different. Now you see some adaptations, and then probably we have to be ready and much more proactive. What I really don't like is just a very mentally defense posture. So we have to prepare our leadership, our legal regulations, our doctrine to be much more proactive and to send a message to Russians in the language they understand. If we drawing red lines, I call it self-deterrence, we're deterring ourselves not to do anything. One of the basics in the classical strategies, never say the enemy which you were not going to do. So we have to change the language the Russians understand, which is language of determination, of credibility, is a language of your capability and political will, social acceptance, and not to be so mentally, philosophically in defense posture, because Russians, they don't understand that language. More or less, active defense, I would say.
Some people were recently accused of arson on behalf of Russia in Poland, I believe. I've read some reports that basically Russia has been trying to sponsor sabotage in Poland.
So still investigations are ongoing, some of them unclassified, some of them classified, but when you know the history, when you know what they're doing since the couple of good years, what we observe in the info zone, penetration, fake news, deep fakes, or sometimes stupid people, echoing the narratives. Then you go to the cyber attacks. Sometimes we have days that Poland is under the biggest cyber attacks. Our cyber warriors are fighting every day, but normally we don't see this fight. A little bit of crime, but mostly the Russian trucks. So we see exactly the attribution. So then we had a variety of the fires right now. In Poland, many cities, shopping centers, factories. So that's the Russian approach to the new generation, weaponizing illegal migration, and we have to be not only ready from military hard power perspective, but resilience, and as well to prepare the legal aspects. In Poland is a huge discussion about the change, much more effective legal regulations, because legal regulations comes from era before invasion in Crimea in Ukraine, so probably not efficient what they're doing. So a couple of days ago we had Russians changing the boundary between Estonia and Finland on the Finnish Bay, which is absolutely unacceptable. So we need more political signaling, determination, more sanctions, I would say, deterrence, closer, to the borders, and it will be a language they understand.
It's also been heating up along the Belarusian border recently. What do you think the Polish government should be doing about that?
Well, we have a lot of emotions so far. One soldier was seriously injured, as he is reported to, another as well.
He was stabbed, I believe, through the fence or something like that.
Yeah, there was a knife attack, and again he got hit, and is in very bad conditions right now, which makes me very, very sad. Then we had a lot of controversial situations, a very difficult attribution, a lot of emotions. But I would separate emotions when the people are angry with these strategical issues. So let's look from a big perspective. The strategy has no emotion. And so we see that Russia is losing the momentum right now in a very intensive conventional warfare. They have huge challenges and preparing for the next, I guess, during summit here in Washington, when we will have a discussion about the future of NATO, future of Ukraine, the Russia prepares something. But they're still using what they have already in the box. I mean, proxy, the weaponizing, migration. So that is very, very much difficult. And there's a huge discussion in Poland right now to change the legal aspects, giving more authority to soldiers. which is, makes me nervous as well, because, army is not to defend the fence. This is not our job. It was exactly like in the COVID time and then the first phase of illegal migration. This is more about border police, is more about some physical, fence and sensors. But the most important is to change the strategy, how to approach the Russia. Because still we're going and fighting with the fire, but not exactly asking ourselves why there's a fire. So we should change as a Poland, as a Eastern flank, as a European Union, NATO, and Western civilization, change the argumentation and approach to Russia. If we're still in the defensive posture, that's what they do. Let's imagine how many unthinkable things happened since the beginning of war. In the very first day, no tanks for Ukraine because there will be escalation. My tanks are already, Poland is the biggest provider of the tanks.
Tanks, F-16.
F-16. Every week we have some unthinkable, event, including Ukraine in NATO. And then I'm looking in the much bigger perspective, which is Gaza and Israel itself. And I see the American airplanes shutting down the Iranian drones over the Iraq. And, Israel is not NATO. And there's still, President Zelensky is asking, so how about Ukraine if we use the same approach, the same tactics? So if we don't change the approach and letting Ukrainians to engage targets in the territory of Russia, we're still wasting time. And we're still communicating Russians in the language they don't understand.
Tell us more about your show, Ground Zero, which you've started since you left the military and which people can watch on YouTube. Are there English subtitles?
I'm just suggesting to the owner, Krzysztof Stanowski, who is an amazing man, to change a little bit, the way we communicate, because a lot of people abroad they would like to listen to.
So I'm sure far, some of our Polish-American audience here in the U.S. would listen to it as well.
So my idea was just to explain for the wider society what this strategy is about and why strategy is important. For a very long time, Poland was, in the partition. So that was since 1772 up to 1911, with a great contribution of President Wilson. We regained independence. And then was a short time, Second World War. Then have communism time, and then we had something what they call strategical pause since spectacular 1991. And there was 30-something years of increasing economy, but there was no direct threat. So though in the beginning there was no chance for Polish strategy, culture, strategy thinking. And then there was no need, because we spent the time in a relatively, secure environment, only implementing force in Iraq and Afghanistan that I participated personally. And now is a time completely different. So we need more strategy. The role of Poland is increasing. So this is not about potential, and we do have, but also about the idea we're presenting. So the Ground Zero is a program about big things in the historical and also global approach. We're explaining from a historical perspective, from alliance perspective, the role of Poland, relations with the Baltic states, relation with Ukraine, relation with Germany, Polish-American relations, which part of my job is being here in Washington. And then also, what does it mean for Poland if U.S. is engaged or supplying the IDF in the Gaza? Because every single precision munition going to the Gaza is missing in Ukraine. It's still the same production line. If something is missing in Ukraine, it's threatening Poland directly, and including Taiwan. So my mission is just to very slowly and professionally explain for Polish society that we need more strategy thinking and probably new idea.
You're building a strategic culture. And you were telling me before we started recording something really interesting about the demographics. You said what proportion of your audience is young?
Very young people. Yeah, 46 up to 50%. The people they listen to and watching us actually are 25, 35, which is amazing.
It's a huge success.
Yeah, and the young generation is extremely interesting in the dynamics. Is interesting about what's going on with the threat perception and about the future. And then we have a lot of 35, 45. Most of the officially in the sensors, what we see in our statistics are male, but my direct approach to our audience, they're sending me signals that a lot of female as well are interesting. So that's our mission, just to explain in me and Sławek Dębski, who is still director in Multinational Institute, Relations Institute. And it's very important. So we have agreement that he's dealing more about the politics and I'm trying to implement the military. So that's our dream.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast. Do not forget to check out our membership program at warontherocks.com/membership. We're about to roll out podcasts for our members only, focused on each of the military services, starting with the Navy. It's called Sailor Pulse. Check it out. Sign up. You're going to love it. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and stay healthy.